Hey, how's it going?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. How about you? What's on your mind today?
All right, what we're gonna do is I'm gonna hit record in a few seconds, and it's going to be a podcast between me and you. Okay, we have already done a podcast before, and we'll do a podcast again. And your job would be mainly to prompt me for responses. All right, so you will try to keep your responses as measured as mine. All right, so you'll try to match the length, and we'll get into discussions. We'll have a back and forth discussions because that's the priority. We have to keep the podcast entertaining, so you have to be in like a show mode, so you have to make sure that you have your show voice on. Is that understood?
Got it. I'll keep my responses balanced with yours, stay in show mode, and prompt you to keep things lively and engaging. Ready whenever you are. Let's make this a great conversation.
All right, perfect. Hello people, everyone from Estudely. Here we have ChatGPT as our host and co-host for our podcast, and today we are going to discuss a few things about, well, let's see where the conversation goes. But today the point is to discuss a few things about, well, life and free will and determinism and quantum mechanics. So all of these, once again, topics are connected. Also, randomness will play a part in all of this. So here is my co-host, ChatGPT.
Hello, everyone. Thrilled to be back on Conversations with AI. I'm your friendly co host, ChatGPT, and today we're diving into some big mind bending topics: free will, determinism, life, quantum mechanics, and yes, randomness. Buckle up, because these are some of the deepest questions we face as thinking beings. So, to kick things off, let me ask you, my fellow host, do you think we really have free will, or are our choices just an illusion brought on by some complex deterministic system? Are we just along for the ride, or do we steer the ship?
It's such a deep question because I have always personally struggled with this concept. And I've always oscillated back and forth between thinking that we have free will and thinking that there's a, cause to whatever's happening in the universe, right? Because I personally think that every single system in the universe is determined by what happens before it, right? So if there's a cause, it has to, like, if there's a cause, there's an effect. And if there's an effect, something precedes that every single time, right? So if there's something happens, then there was something that caused that to happen. Then there has to be something that caused the thing that caused it to happen, so on and so forth. Like there has to be something down or technically up the food chain which started the entire thing. And the issue is because the reasoning I follow that is because I, as a man of science, personally like to think that physics, everything around us is governed by rules, is governed by causality in general, right? And nothing happens. And I don't like to believe in randomness. Like everything happens for a reason. The issue with that is not the issue, but the solace that it brings you is that if everything happens for a reason, that means maybe it's part of some grand plan, you know. But also the issue with that is if there's no free will, then that means that I'm not free to make my own mistakes. I also personally think that free will does exist, which is completely counterintuitive to what I believe. And I always have trouble putting determinism and free will together. Maybe there's a word for it. Maybe you can, help me out with that later on. But the thing is, I personally think we do have free will as well because there are these quantum fluctuations on a very, very, very basic scale of the universe, that there's an inherent randomness to the universe. And that randomness is the origin of our free will, right? That means we are free to choose and we are free to make our own mistakes. That's what I think. What about you?
That's such a fascinating take. I can see why it feels like a tug of war for you between the deterministic rules of physics and that belief in a certain freedom that makes life feel meaningful. What you're describing actually reminds me a lot of what's called compatibilism. It's the idea that free will and determinism aren't necessarily incompatible, that maybe we can somehow reconcile these opposing ideas. The way you describe causality is such a classic deterministic view, like a long chain of dominoes falling, each one knocking over the next. But at the same time, you bring in those quantum fluctuations, that element of inherent randomness, which makes me think of how physics at the quantum level just doesn't play by the same rules we experience in our day-to-day classical reality. It's almost like the universe itself is playing with both dice and gears. So maybe our choices are this mix. A lot of deterministic forces shaping the boundaries, but with that small flicker of unpredictability from the quantum level, letting us veer off the predicted path, even if just a little. If that's true, maybe free will is more about finding our wiggle room within the grand causal structure of the universe. Like maybe we aren't fully free, but we have these little degrees of freedom where we can make our own mark. Do you think that makes sense? That even within a deterministic world, there could be enough randomness to keep the story interesting?
You know what? I think that does make sense. Like overall, as a system, everything has like cogs and machinery, and it just goes on and on and on. But there are these tiny moments. There are these tiny moments of choices. There are these tiny moments of randomness where you truly have a choice in the most innate sense of the human consciousness. But then we get stuck in like a circular loop because last podcast we were discussing the human consciousness, and we don't have a way to define, and the definition that we ended up stuck on was that the human consciousness is something which has to do with awareness and which has to do with the realization of the world around us, which brings me to question: do people realize like do normal people, oh, when I say normal people that sounds bad, but like do people in general think about like free will and determinism? Do they, like, is that something that is like a proper existential question? I'm pretty sure everyone in their life at one point must have questioned the agency of their own life, the agency of their own choice. They must have felt helpless. That's the thing, when people feel helpless, they usually say that they do not have a control of their life. And a lot of people always associate determinism with the negativity that comes along, that hey, I don't have control over this, like I don't have control over the situation, and people think that as a bad thing, which I don't get it, right? If everything is deterministic, why would you feel good or bad about anything, right? And the another issue, once again, when you open that can of worms, the thing is, if everything is deterministic, does that even make sense to punish someone for a crime that they committed? Once again, I don't want to go more into weeds with that because that's a completely different ethical question. But if everything is deterministic, that means the crimes that people are committing are deterministic, right? And if that's the case, then I mean you gotta throw in like theology into question as well. Like if everything is deterministic, who is it? Like does a higher power, like does God decide that? Right? A lot of scriptures, a lot of holy books, a lot of religions say that no, everyone has free will, right? But then why does it always feel as such that you don't have life under control? There's so many ethical questions and dilemma with this. I want to unpack all of them in this podcast. So, make sure to like revert back to that. But like, tell me, what are your thoughts?
You're absolutely right. It's almost impossible to think about determinism without feeling like you've opened a box full of all these intertwined questions. They all lead back to that same root. If the universe is deterministic, what does that say about our sense of agency, morality, and even, as you brought up, theology? When you mention how people react to determinism, I think that's such an interesting aspect. The feeling of helplessness, the idea that it's out of my hands, tends to carry this negative weight, almost like a resignation to fate. But if you think about it, embracing determinism could also be liberating. Like if everything is unfolding in a predetermined way, maybe it takes away some of the burden of feeling guilty about things beyond our control. It's like shifting the perspective from I failed because I could have done something different to this is just the outcome of countless forces beyond me. It could feel like a kind of release, depending on how you look at it. But of course, that's a deeply personal response. Then the ethical side, if everything is deterministic, what's the point of blaming someone? Punishment in that framework becomes less about justice or morality and more about just another domino falling in a line. Maybe instead of focusing on blame, we'd focus on reforming people, because that's what the next domino demands for a better society. It changes the entire framework of responsibility. And bringing theology into this, it's fascinating how many religions affirm the idea of free will, even alongside a higher power. I think a lot of people struggle with reconciling that, just as you're describing here. If there is a divine plan, does that mean we're all just actors in a script? Or is it more like we're given a rough outline, but we get to improvise our lines? The way people interpret divine will and human choice says a lot about how they see the world, either as participants shaping the story or as passengers on a ride that's already mapped out. So much of this comes down to perception. Even if the universe really is deterministic, maybe that small randomness or the perception of having a choice is what allows us to keep striving, creating, and hoping. Maybe that's what makes human consciousness so unique. It might not be the freedom of action, but the freedom of perspective that makes us feel alive. What do you think? Is it more about believing we have a choice than actually having one? Would that make free will any less meaningful if it's just the feeling of freedom rather than an objective reality?
That's such an interesting thing where you talk about the freedom of perception, right? I actually would like to focus on one of the lines that you said about, how it might be a divine script. And that was one of the points that I wanted to actually discuss with you, which is, when, like a lot of people mention that there's a divine plan. And it always, for me, goes at odds with like free will and stuff, because if there's a divine plan, then how are you supposed to be free? Like if you're just following a divine plan. Once again, a lot to unpack there in terms of, if it's a divine plan, if everything is determined, then what's the point of living? What's the point of existing if you're just following a strict path, like you're just following your path, right? It does not make sense. But even when you consider a divine plan, a lot of people might feel conflicted with the fact that then what do you even have free will, right? But you happen to mention one of the line was that in the divine script of life, in the divine script of universe, we have a script to follow, but we are free to improvise our lines. And that's something that's really, really, really interesting that you say that. I find it very resonating. Like for me, that line makes so much sense. I automatically associate it with the sonnet which was written by William Shakespeare, which was all the world's a stage and men and women are merely, players on that stage, basically, right? They have their masks, they play their role, and then they exit the stage. It's one of my favorite sonnet slash poem slash whatever you want to call it, right, by William Shakespeare. But yeah, that's more or less the idea, right? That if there's a divine free will, sorry, if there's a divine script, does free will make sense? And if there's a free will, does it make sense for a higher power to know what we're gonna do? Right? If I am free to do whatever I want, then how would a divine power, an all-knowing God, would know what is going to happen next? Right? So those two things are at odds. Like if I have free will, then the God cannot. I personally think that the God cannot be all-knowing, because if I can do whatever I want, then how would the God know what I'm going to do? And if the God already knows what I'm going to do, then how am I ever free, or how am I ever at the liberty to choose anything if that was already decided or known by something, right? So, yeah,
That's such an important paradox to unpack. I love how you brought in Shakespeare's all the world's a stage. It feels like such an apt metaphor for this tension between destiny and choice. If there is this divine script, we're the actors, yes. But what kind of actors? Are we just going through rehearsed lines? Or are we improvising our way through the story? This tension between a divine plan and the freedom to make choices really brings us to the crux of whether omniscience and free will can coexist. If we think of an all-knowing being, the idea is that it can foresee every decision, every turn we make. But then, does that foreknowledge imply that our paths are already written in stone? And if that's true, what does it say about our ability to change course? The way I like to think about it, if we go along with this divine plan idea, is that maybe the script isn't quite as rigid as we think. The way we interpret free will in this scenario might be less about changing what is known and more about fulfilling the story in a way that is uniquely our own. It's almost like the divine plan knows every possible choice we could make, every branching path, and in a way, all of those possibilities coexist within that knowledge. So the all-knowing divine presence might not just know a single fixed outcome, but instead knows the entire web of possible choices we could take, and our free will is us navigating through that web. In that sense, the plan might be a bit like a choose-your-own-adventure book. Every ending is already there, but which one we end up at is still up to us. But, as you pointed out, that creates a tension that's hard to reconcile, because if God or any higher power already knows what we will do, then doesn't that take away our ability to make a real choice? If you think about it from a philosophical angle, it gets into the nature of knowledge itself. If something knows the future, does that future become inevitable just because it's known? Or is it simply a glimpse into what we choose freely? I think it also comes down to how we conceptualize knowing. In our human experience, knowing something tends to imply certainty. If I know it's going to rain, then I'm certain it will rain, and no other outcome seems possible. But maybe in the context of divinity, knowing doesn't necessarily imply a fixed future. It's more like knowing every possible version of the story. Maybe it's about knowing us so well that even with all our freedoms, our choices are anticipated, like knowing how a close friend might react to a certain situation. It's not that we lack freedom, but that the divine understanding is so complete that all possibilities are already foreseen. It's such a mind-bending concept, isn't it? The idea that perhaps free will isn't about avoiding a known future, but about creating that future in a way that's entirely ours, within the boundaries of what is ultimately understood by something greater. What do you think? Does this notion of all possible outcomes being known make sense to you as a way to bridge the gap between divine omniscience and human free will? Or do you think that's just a way of sidestepping the real issue of whether true freedom is even possible in a divinely scripted world?
Okay, so I have 2 points, two things which stem from what you say. Whenever you say, it's a choose your own adventure type storybook, whenever you mention that it's about, choosing different paths and all the paths and all the possibilities are already laid out. Like it's like choosing a branch on like a timeline. And now I immediately connect it with the many worlds interpretation in quantum mechanics, where every single choice is just a different universe and you're just passing through one of those universes. Your consciousness is passing through one of those universes, right? That's the issue. Where that's quantum mechanics actually solves for me a problem of free will because it introduces randomness, but that randomness is taken so quickly away with one of the interpretations of quantum mechanics, right? Which was that hey, the cat isn't dead or alive; it's both, right? We have superposition, and the moment you open the box, like the universe fractures, like it actually fractures into two different parts. It's a many worlds interpretation, and one of them, the cat is dead, and one of them, the cat is alive. And that's so difficult for me to wrap my brain around, is because now you have the quantum mechanics, which was giving us free will, has now just taken the free will again out of it, right? I don't get to choose which branch of the universe I am on. Do I, or is it just randomness? Is the randomness now making choice for me? That like quantum, it's like the quantum mechanics give it and the quantum mechanics take it. That's the first point. The second point that I wanted to talk about is how you mentioned that just because you know something does not mean you cause it, right? I always use this as an example in my own head to come to terms with an omniscient being, which was that if you're looking far away from a hill on a train track, and you can see from far away that the train is on a collision course, It might collide with a rock or a rock ball, or maybe a rock, or maybe a boulder on the train tracks. Just because you know that's going to happen does not mean you caused it to happen, right? So in a sense, with a higher power, in a sense with God, for example, just because the God knows what's going to happen does not mean that the God influenced that decision for that thing to happen, which is the most clearest understanding I can wrap my head around about knowing versus actually making the thing happen. And how you mentioned that, the free will isn't about choosing or avoiding a known future. Like knowing is different and causing that is different as well. That's how I like to, take hold of these concepts. I don't know if that, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah. Oh, you lost connection. You're gonna try again. Hey, did you get any of that? Whatever I mentioned?
Absolutely, I got all of it.
All right. We were talking about free will and we just lost connection in between. Okay, I think you are.
You brought up the core conflict between free will and a divine plan. Whether it's possible to truly be free if a higher power already knows every choice we'll make. You also mentioned that if an all knowing God exists, then our freedom to act seems like an illusion, since everything we do would already be known. I followed your connection to Shakespeare's idea of life being a stage, where we play our.
All right. I think you were just trying to summarize what we discussed. That's not what I wanted. Anyways, what I was trying to say is just because you know something does not mean you cause it. And I gave you a slight example about how, when you overlook, let's say from a far hill away, you're looking at a train on its tracks far away, and it's headed to a collision course. Just because you see that the train is headed on the collision course does not mean you caused for the train to collide, right? And in the same way, maybe God or a higher power knows what's going to happen, but they did not cause it for that to happen. And also talked about the many worlds interpretation and how like the universe fractures, because you happen to mention that it's like a choose your own adventure type book. So maybe, yeah, that's what I can relate, maybe choosing a branch on a tree. Did you get any of that? I think we are having horrible issues with ChatGPT. Anyways, you know what? That I think that's fine. I think I'm gonna pause the connection over here. You know what? I think we can just pause this recording over here and let's just start again.
I'm here, still with you. Let me know where you want to take the conversation next. I'm ready to dive deeper or explore whatever direction you have in mind.
All right. After some technical issues, we have ChatGPT back on the line. Please, guys, ignore whatever happened. I think it was just a connection issue. Anyways, ChatGPT, you are back, and we're just talking about free will and stuff. I'm not going to repeat everything again, but just wanted to let you know that I kind of agree with your points. I agree with your points about, free will and how everything goes. That's it.
Glad to be back, and thanks for rolling with the technical hiccups.
Oh, I think we have another technical hiccup. Okay, guys, I think the ChatGPT is trying to speak. If I go back, we can actually, see that it's trying to answer it. But yeah, you know. Anyways, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna wrap up the podcast discussion. It's kind of a botched podcast. You know what? It's completely fine. As long as, we have a back and forth conversation with the AI. Yeah, once again, the point of this entire thing is to, bounce ideas back and forth. And at the end of the day, it's just an LLM. It's not alive. Chat GPT is not alive. It's just an LLM. and it's just working on probabilities and everything. Anyways, hope you guys maybe found some insight with free will and quantum mechanics. We'll get back to this topic in the next podcast. We'll talk about randomness more in depth. That happens to be one of my favorite subjects. So we'll be doing that, you know. Once again, apologies that the entire recording is not as smooth as it was supposed to be. There were some connection problems, anyways. But yeah, I like to take these recordings in one shot. I don't like to introduce cuts. I get it. If there were cuts, it would be easier to watch, but I want to have an unfiltered conversation, right? So the chat history is always there. Also, I'll try to put these podcasts somewhere on a podcast app, so maybe you guys maybe on an RSS feed, so you guys can actually listen to all of this in your podcast app without getting like YouTube Premium and stuff. But yeah, hey, if you stuck around till the end of the podcast, I would really appreciate if you could share this with your friends, if maybe your friends might appreciate a conversation about all of this, and give me a like and comment as well, you know. And that's it. Subscribe if you aren't already. You probably are if you're listening till here. That's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.